Okay, so today we're looking at this topic, the problem of being good. Now you might not immediately think that is a problem, but hopefully by the end of this presentation you'll begin to understand why this is a perennial problem for Christians. About 30 years ago, I was walking in the Peak District towards this beautiful place. It's known as Three Shires Head. At the pool below this old packhorse bridge on a saltway, the three shires of Cheshire, Derbyshire and Staffordshire meet. Now as I walked along I fell into step with an older gentleman and we got talking. Turned out he was Professor Green, who at that time was the Chancellor of the Manchester Metropolitan University. Now since I was studying at a satellite university campus to the Manchester Metropolitan, we immediately had something in common, and so we spent some time walking along together, talking. At some point in the conversation I mentioned the fact I was a Christian, to which his response was that he had never read anything in the Gospels. He was a very knowledgeable man. He had never read anything in the Gospels which, he said, he had not read earlier and better amongst the various humanist authors, and he was referring specifically to the Greek philosophers and so on, people like Plato or Socrates or Lucretius. And his argument was, and seems to me still to be fairly valid, that oftentimes Jesus, quoted in the Gospels, does indeed quote from these earlier sources. So, for example, just a couple of quotes here I found on the internet. You will notice, if you are familiar with the Gospels and with the teaching of Jesus, that there are similarities, there are common themes. The secret of happiness, says Socrates, is not found in seeking more, but in developing the capacity to enjoy less. And the Bible presents that as godliness with contentment. Being content with what you have is great gain. So you can see how these themes continue. Now, there are two reasons why this happens. The first is, truth is always truth, and wisdom is always wisdom. So it doesn't really matter much whether you are quoting from a Greek philosopher or a more modern thinker, or Jesus, or God in the Bible. You find that wisdom is still wisdom, and wise words will therefore tend to dwell on certain themes. The second thing is, of course, that some of these philosophers were still very much quoted and known and spoken about in Jesus' day, and so for him to offer similar words of wisdom was no more than identifying with his audience the way any good teacher would. But as for this claim that there's nothing in the Gospels which might not be found elsewhere in humanist writings, that, I'm afraid, is completely in error. And the problem has nothing to do with a wise philosophy of life, but rather to do with the standard for living that God sets us. And God says the following things. Jesus says this: if you love me, keep my commandments. But it goes further than that. It says that we need to be perfect. And so the problem becomes not just, is there a wise standard presented in the Gospels, but the discussion becomes about whether or not we have any chance of attaining that standard. Now the standard initially, as given perhaps in the Old Testament, in the 10 Commandments, do not kill, do not commit adultery, don't steal, those things seem at first fairly straightforward, but the problem we have is with this thing called sin. What is sin? What does it mean to do wrong? What does it mean to fall out of favour with God? One answer to that is given by John towards the end of the New Testament, who says that anyone who sins breaks the law. And this simplistic understanding, if this were all the Bible taught on the subject, it would appear fairly straightforward. All we need to do is keep the rules. And having set out what the rules are, we then need very, very harsh penalties for rule breaking, up to and including the execution, the elimination from society of anyone who breaks the rules. Of course, we'll throw in some rewards for those who keep the rules successfully, and we will accept no excuses. Surely we would think that would mean we would be sinless. It would also mean we'd live in a utopian society, wouldn't it? The trouble is, it's never really worked out. And it doesn't matter whether you go back historically to the various humanist regimes or attempts at, as I said, utopian societies, or whether you look at the Pharisees of Jesus' time, who thought that by adding infinite layers of rules to the original rules of God, they could somehow, coerce and mold people's behavior so that it would be perfect. It didn't work in either of those cases. And the same is true of modern perfectionism. Okay? Anyone who thinks they can do this, they can keep these rules, if they just get the right motivation, if they just get the right, support from God, whatever, they can keep these rules perfectly, they are misguided. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why. You see, the real problem we have, and the reason why the Gospels presented Jesus who had to die on the cross, and we'll come back to that thought later on, is not so much about our sin as being individual acts where we break the law, as about the fact that we are sinners. We are sinful. It's not so much what we do, though that is of course a problem for many reasons. It's what we are. So, to illustrate, 3 problems. The first of them is this. Quite simply, no matter how hard we try, no matter how good our intentions, we just don't manage to keep the rules. I mean, just think about it like this. You're driving along the road one day, you look in the mirror, you see a police car following you. How does your driving behaviour change? No, it's not because you set out that morning with a gung-ho attitude that you're going to break all the rules and you don't care about speed limits or road markings or signage or anything else. You're just going to drive, like anarchy on wheels. No, you probably set out with the best intentions. But when you realise there's a policeman behind you, you suddenly start to wonder whether your best intentions are good enough, and you start to modify your behaviour. And of course, just thinking about driving, I wonder how many times a day we break the law if we're driving. How many times does our speed creep up a little bit on a slope? Or do we, maybe cut across a junction a bit wrong, or not quite stop at a stop sign, or, 100 different ways in which we break the rules. What about God's standard, that standard which is perfection? How many times a day do we fall short of God's perfect standard? And so for that reason, the Bible says this: all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The glorious standard, this very, very high, perfect standard to which we're called. Notice that. All have sinned and fallen short. Even if somehow, just today, I was able to keep the rules perfectly, what about yesterday? What about the day before? What about 10 years ago? Okay, so at some point, all of us fall short of the standard. And of course, it's one thing to look back, but what about tomorrow? What about the temptations and situations I may find myself in tomorrow? Okay, so all of us fall short of this standard. So that's the first problem. There's no point saying, here are the rules, just keep them, and here are the penalties and the rewards. We don't. We slip up, we make mistakes. Problem number 2 is, in a way, a little bit more subtle and even more challenging. In his first public message, his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said the following thing: "You have heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery." So he was quoting from the Old Testament law. And this, up until that full stop in the sentence, it is something we could possibly attain. Okay, do not commit adultery. That's fine. I wouldn't dare, my wife would kill me. Okay, so there will be lots of people who could honestly put hand on heart and say, I've never done this. I've never committed adultery. But Jesus goes on and he says, I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And this presents 2 problems. The first is that it raises the standard incredibly high. Just not sleeping with someone who's not my wife is something I could attain. But never entertaining a lustful thought, that's a much higher standard, isn't it? But there's another problem with this, which is, how do we exactly define lust? See, here's the problem. This idea of looking at a woman lustfully sits somewhere along a continuum. Now, at one end of this continuum is natural attraction between, speaking in my instance, a man and an attractive woman, a beautiful woman. And this is thankfully, the basis upon which human civilization has continued. If men were not attracted to women, the human race would have died out a long time ago. And I can speak from personal experience. Almost 26 years ago, I walked into a room, and I looked around that room and I saw a beautiful woman, and I thought, wow, she's nice. I wouldn't mind getting to know her. And in just a few months' time, we will celebrate 24 years of marriage. So this is my point. At one end of this scale is a good, healthy, natural, necessary attraction between a man and a woman. Now, at the other end of the scale is something I think we'd all agree is wrong. Pornography. This separation of the visual and sexual from the person of a woman. Again, speaking from a man's point of view, though I'm not unaware that it also works the other way around. Most of us would agree that's wrong, that this lust or desire, which is completely separated from any context, we can easily identify that as being sin. But here's the problem. Whereabouts along that line do you actually draw your line and say, look, if you're one side of this, that sounds healthy and natural and there's nothing wrong with it. But if you're the other side of this, it's a problem. Now let me illustrate just how utterly insane this can become if we try to do this with the following example. I went on the internet and I found this. Please don't laugh, it is slightly embarrassing to admit that this was found on a Christian website. But here's the thing. In Isaiah 47, there is a reference to the idea that if a woman's thigh is uncovered, okay, this is immoral. Now, I would encourage you, if you are at all interested in such a thing, to go and look at the verse, and you'll realise that this is not in the context of what ordinary, everyday people wear to participate in sport or do their job or anything else, okay? This is a very, very specific reference and very specific context. However, so our first problem is that, someone's taken this out of context and assumed it might apply to all women everywhere. But that's not really the problem. The problem is this, okay? That this person has gone and got an X-ray, okay? And from that X-ray, they have determined that the thigh bone actually extends below the kneecap. And so the thigh begins, as we say, below the kneecap, and therefore a very modest skirt which ends above the knees is in fact making its wearer immoral. Just think about that for a moment. If your skirt is 5 millimeters below the kneecap, you're okay, you're a moral person. But take away that 5 millimeters and now it's above the kneecap, and now you're immoral. Really? It seems ridiculous, but this is the problem we have with this kind of ruling that Jesus gives. He says don't lust, but what exactly is lust? And we end up with rules to explain rules to explain rules. You get the idea. Our best honest attempts at figuring out what's right and what's wrong end up with this kind of absurdity. So the second problem, overarching problem we have, is that the standard is incredibly high, much higher than any of us can probably attain to, and the standard is not, to us as sinful people, the standard is not clear. Okay, let's move on to the third problem. Let me tell you a story. About 20 years ago, I was driving down a fairly narrow road, came around a bit of a corner, and there was a builder's lorry blocking half the road, unloading building materials. Well, the lorry was on the other side of the road, so technically I had right of way. But the problem was, try and imagine this situation, okay? Just beyond the back of the lorry was a junction. And there was a car going in my direction trying to turn into the junction, but it couldn't turn into the junction because a car was waiting to turn out of the junction. But the car waiting to come out of the junction couldn't turn onto the road because there was another car in the way waiting to come past the lorry. And the car waiting to come past the lorry couldn't come past the lorry because I was in the way. Okay, I hope you get that picture. So I did legally have right of way. I could have simply driven past the lorry into the space and said, well, you guys are in a mess, sort yourselves out, get out of my way, I have legal right of way. But I decided to be good and courteous. Now I want to make that point clear. My intentions were good. Okay, I wanted to be kind, considerate, courteous to other road users, And I realised that the easiest way to resolve the whole problem was for me to back up about half a vehicle's length, and then the car behind the lorry could come towards me, and the car trying to turn out of the junction could turn into that space, and the car waiting to turn into the junction could go. Everyone could get on with their day. It seemed like a good solution. Okay, so I looked around. There was no reason why I couldn't reverse. It wasn't a one-way street or anything like that. I then carefully checked my mirrors. Now, I should clarify at this moment, I was driving a van at the time. Okay, so I checked both mirrors, but there was no middle mirror. I even did an over-the-shoulder check, being extra super careful. Checked the mirrors again. There was nothing behind me. So I put the van in reverse and backed up and rather modified the front of a Land Rover Discovery, which had somehow managed to pull up so close behind me and so carefully centred that I couldn't see it in either of my mirrors. And I wonder how often we've had that experience. We set out with the best intentions to do good, not just to do the minimum, but to go beyond, to be kind, courteous, considerate to others, thoughtful, generous. We keep the law, we do everything we know to do right, but then it goes wrong. And I'm sure we've had that experience in many different ways, not just with driving, okay? There's a verse for that in the Bible. It says this: all of us have become like one who is unclean. Notice again that inclusivity. All of us. Our righteous acts, that's the good things we do. The law-keeping things, the things that should make us right with God. Those righteous acts are like filthy, disgusting, smelly rags, according to God. So these three problems leave us in a situation of recognizing and accepting that we are simply not good enough. Our righteous acts are like filthy rags, and we all shrivel up like a leaf, and the wind sweeps us away. The wind, like the wind, our sins sweep us away. And the problem with that is, as the Bible also says, the wages of sin is death. And we're talking about eternal death here, the end of existence. So what can we do? It's all very well proving we're not good enough. It's all very well proving that a philosophy, a set of rules to live by, whether it's from ancient philosophers or from the Gospels or from something more modern, is simply not good enough. But what is the solution? Is there any hope? Well, the Christian believes that the hope lies in two things. First, in judgment. We will all face judgment and give account for our lives. But that in that judgment, we will rely on what Jesus did on the cross for us. We believe that Jesus died in our place. So the wages of sin were paid, as it were, the debt of sin was paid by him, so that we are legally deemed to be without fault, even though, based on those three different problems I've just outlined to you, we are far from innocent. Jesus explains this using an illustration, and it's a perfect way to actually make sense of this whole thing. So let me share it with you. In Matthew chapter 22, there's a story about a king who wanted to throw a banquet, a wedding banquet for his son. Now, just before we get into the story, let me explain something. In the West, in modern times, if we tell a story, we begin by setting out the scene. We introduce the characters, and then we build on top of that the story itself. Oftentimes, when we read stories in the Bible, they're not told that way. You have to read through the whole story to get to the end to find the piece of information which makes the beginning of the story make any sense. And the same is true in this case. So rather than just read it from the Bible, I'll try and sort of summarize the story for you. Here was this king. He throws a wedding banquet, and then he sends out the invitation, presumably to people who've been invited previously, and says, hey, dinner's ready, come along. We may assume that these were good people, the good and the great, the MPs, the businessmen, the bankers, the nobles, the politicians, etc. Okay, and they were invited to this meal because it's a king's banquet. You don't invite just anyone. Trouble is, for reasons which are important but not necessary for us to explore today, they decided they didn't want to go to the meal, and so off they went to different jobs, to different things. And the king suddenly realised he had this rather embarrassing situation of a wedding banquet for his son, the bride's family showing up, and there being no guests, and it looking like the king had no friends, no social circle, So he instructed his servants to go out and find just anybody they could and invite them in, drag them in if necessary, and fill up the banqueting hall. Well, this is where we have to take a bit of information from the end of the story and feed it back into the beginning of the story. You see, all those nobles, all of those businessmen, all of those rich people who were invited in the first instance would undoubtedly have spent weeks or maybe months preparing. And they undoubtedly would have gone to the tailor and had a very, very nice suit indeed made for them to attend this wedding. But when you go out and you drag random people off the street, you get a very different situation. You get the farmer with muck on his boots. You get the builder who's been laying concrete and it's splashed all over his trousers. You get the mechanic who's been up to the elbows in an engine or a machine and he's got grease all the way up his sleeves. You can't have people like that sitting in a king's palace. And so what the king has done, remember, it's just a story. He doesn't actually have to go out and find a tailor in a hurry. What this king has done is prepare for each of these people to be given a wedding robe. So as they come into the wedding banquet venue, they're given this robe which covers up what they are. Covered by this robe, you can't see the muck on the farmer's boots. You can't see the concrete splashed all over the builder, and you can't see the grease all over the mechanic. And in fact, the only person who gets physically thrown out of the banquet is a man who somehow or other, for whatever reason, shows up in what he thinks is his best suit, and he thinks that's good enough, so he refuses to accept the king's gift of a robe, and he's thrown out. Now, what's the story all about? Well, quite simply, Jesus is referring back to something with which his listeners at the time would have been very familiar. This passage here from Isaiah. I rejoice, I delight greatly in my Lord. My soul rejoices in my God, for he has clothed me with garments of salvation. Salvation means to be saved from that fate of death, which is the deserved consequence of our wrongdoing. He has arrayed me in a robe of his righteousness. Okay, you notice the parallels with that parable. As a bridegroom adorns his head like a priest, and as a bride adorns herself with her jewels. Okay, so Jesus is referring in this parable, in the story of the king and the wedding banquet, back to this: garments of salvation and a robe of righteousness. We are covered over by a gift of God, by the act and life of Jesus. We are covered and made to look as though we're clean, we're sinless, even though underneath, of course, we're not. Now, there's a little bit more to it than that, obviously, but we're not going to get into anything quite that deep. We're going to instead address a very complex question. It's all very well understanding that illustration. That's great. But how do we go about turning an illustration into a reality? Well, in Acts chapter 16, there's a story of a man, a jailer, as it happens, who had a rather life-changing experience, a near-death experience, you might say. And in that moment, he was forced to confront the fact that he had perhaps not made all the wisest choices in life. And confronted with the potential of his own demise, he decided he needed to change his life around. So he spoke to Paul, and he said, "What do I need to do to be saved?" The idea of salvation again. And Paul replied with this simple message: believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved. You and all your household, okay? But what does it mean to believe? What's belief all about? Is it simply something that happens in our head? Well, belief starts with knowledge. Just imagine you're going out to buy a car. You would be very foolish indeed if you simply walked past the garage and went, "Oh, I'll have that one because I like the colour." Rather, you'd be very wise to look up things like the Which Report or the online reviews or whatever else to find out information and knowledge about that vehicle. In exactly the same way, when we think of becoming Christian, we study the Bible. We read through devotional books and so on. We want to learn more about God. We look at the historicity of Jesus. Again, we want knowledge. We need to know more about God. This is the beginning of belief. What comes next, though, is important, and that is experience. It is highly unlikely that we would buy a car, especially if we were spending a lot of money on it, without first test driving it. And in exactly the same way, belief is based upon experience. We need to go out into our lives armed with the knowledge we have gained about God, and now we need to experience God. We need to pray and look for answers to prayer. We need to interpret situations we find ourselves in light of the fact that we now know, that knowledge, that God is leading in our life. We need to experience God. But next comes something that some Christians are a little uncomfortable with, and that is the emotional or intuitive response to God. This quote describes intuition as the whisper of the soul. I prefer to think of it in terms of, if you were going to marry someone, it wouldn't be enough just to know about them, nor would it be enough just to experience their company and say, yeah, we get along all right. You'd want there to be a bit more. You'd want to fall in love with this person. And in the same way, we need to have, if we're really going to have true belief, we need some kind of emotional or intuitive response to God. We can't see him physically, so that response needs to be from somewhere rather deeper. And finally, those parts of the belief process lead to trust and faith, words that every Christian is familiar with. Okay, so that's what belief is all about. Is that all there is to it? Well, again, no, not quite. Let's go back to the Old Testament. See, this problem with wrongdoing and sin was there in the Old Testament as well. But in the Old Testament, it was dealt with in a slightly different way. If you did something that was wrong, and you recognized you'd done wrong, you had to take a lamb, go up to the temple, present this lamb before the priest, and make a sacrifice. Now, we might think this rather barbaric, but this was common enough practice amongst numerous religions at the time, but God sort of repurposed this and said, no, that what's happening here is that you're killing this lamb in your place. It's paying the price for your wrongdoing, as it were. Okay, but this process, which could leave you legally innocent, as it were, would only work if you bought into the process. You know, you could be a farmer with 1,000 suitable lambs, living just a minute's walk from the temple. There could be a whole army of priests on standby. But until you take one of those lambs and you go to the temple and you present it to the priest and you confess what you've done wrong, you will not be cleansed from your sin. You have to buy into it through your actions. And by the way, just to mention this here, because people who try to do all of this in their own strength because, hey, you know, if I just try hard enough I can be perfect, are very much like people who are trying DIY sacrifices. In other words, I may have these 1,000 sheep, and if I stand in my field and I kill them all, you know, surely that will do, won't it? No, it won't. No, the only way to actually get this forgiveness is to go to the priest, and our priest is Jesus, and to get involved in the system, which is Jesus' sacrifice and his pleading our case in heaven. We have to buy into it. So how do we buy into this as Christians? You know, you can't just go to church and buy a robe of righteousness. Well, there's a two-part response. God does say this, if you love me, keep my commandments. But thankfully, that statement is clarified again by John, 1 John. He says the following thing. The first thing is to believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ. We've already dealt with this. But the second is this, to love one another as he commanded us. And look, this isn't some kind of soppy, emotional love. This isn't love that makes the heart beat a little bit quicker when we see someone. This is principled love. This is love that prefers the other person over ourselves. This is love that causes us to keep quiet when otherwise we might speak up. This is love that causes us to speak up when otherwise we might take the easier path of keeping quiet. This is love that means we treat the other person better than ourselves. The Bible has a lot to say about this that you can find out about if you want to. But we must love one another. It's through these acts of love, acts of charity, acts of caring, that we buy into the system. We buy into putting on the robe of Christ's righteousness and being covered, even though we slip up, we can't attain to a high standard, and even though our best efforts are like filthy rags. So what do we have to do? Well, first of all, interestingly enough, there is a place for the law. Because we love God, we want to live the way that Jesus lived. So we seek to emulate or copy the life of Jesus. And those commandments in the Bible tell us the best way to live. Next, we want to further our knowledge and our experience with God. Okay, going back to this idea of believing in God, we need to further our knowledge and further our experience on a daily basis in order to be part of this system, if you like, of being covered by the wedding garment, being forgiven. Finally, we must constantly work to love each other, because our love for one another is a key measure of our belief. The one thing we mustn't do is aim for self-reliance. This is one of the devil's most effective traps used against Christians. Because the Bible is full of rules and regulations, it's so tempting to think that just by keeping them, by forcing ourselves, by engineering situations in which we think we can keep those rules, this will make us good Christians and God will be happy with us. But really, that is just a humanist philosophy. And as Professor Green pointed out, it was tried long before the Gospels came along. And it didn't work then, and it won't work now, because it's impossible to actually achieve that standard. People still try, and of course for all the right reasons. But I hope I've shown you today just how impossible it is to actually achieve that kind of standard. Our only hope is to put our trust in the robe of Christ's righteousness.